You're living through a moment that textbooks will argue about for decades. Right now, as you're watching this, the Middle East is not just on fire, it's being reorganized. When Donald Trump steps in front of a microphone and warns that bombs will be dropping everywhere, most people hear a headline, but what they miss is the architecture behind those words. The pressure systems, the back-channel ultimatums, the financial leverage that forces nations into corners they can't escape from without a fight. Iran didn't strike in a vacuum. Nothing in geopolitics ever does. These moves are choreographed by forces that run deeper than any single president, any single regime, any single news cycle. What we're really watching is the slow grinding collapse of a unipolar world order, and the people losing that order are not going quietly. The dollar, the bases, the alliances, all of it is now on the table. And if you want to understand why Trump said what he said, you need to understand what's actually at stake, because it isn't just about Iran. Let me start where most analysts are too afraid to go. Iran didn't just launch strikes. Iran sent a message, a carefully calculated, deliberately timed message, and it was not addressed to Israel alone. It was addressed to Washington, to Riyadh, to every power broker sitting in a quiet room somewhere deciding the fate of nations they've never visited. And when Trump responded by warning that bombs will be dropping everywhere, he wasn't just emoting, he was signaling. He was telling certain people who understand the language of power, that the rules of the game have now fundamentally changed. Now here's what you need to understand about the world we're living in. For the last 80 years, the United States has operated as the architect of a global order that was built on a very simple premise. American military supremacy, backed by the dollar, would maintain a kind of enforced peace. Not a just peace, not a fair peace, but a functional one. The kind of peace that kept oil flowing, kept trade routes open, kept the wheels of the global economy turning in a direction that happened to benefit American financial interests most of all. That was the deal. And for a long time, even the countries that resented it accepted it, because the alternative, chaos, seemed worse. But something shifted. And it didn't shift overnight. It shifted across 2 decades of catastrophic American military adventures, across the wreckage of Iraq and Libya and Afghanistan, across the 2008 financial crisis that exposed the rot inside the system, across the sanctions overreach that pushed nation after nation to start quietly building alternatives to SWIFT, to the dollar, to American-dominated financial infrastructure. The United States didn't just lose wars, it lost credibility. And in geopolitics, credibility is everything. Once you lose it, getting it back requires either a miracle or an enormous amount of violence. That's the context in which Trump is operating right now. And I want you to really sit with that, because a lot of the commentary you're going to hear about these Iran strikes is going to treat this as an isolated event. Iran did this, Israel responded like that, Trump said something dramatic, now we wait to see what happens next. That framing is almost completely useless. It tells you nothing about why this is happening, who is driving it, and where it is ultimately going. So let's talk about Iran for a moment, because Iran is one of the most misrepresented countries in American media. What you're typically told is that Iran is a rogue state, a sponsor of terrorism, a regime run by religious fanatics who hate freedom and want to build a nuclear bomb so they can destroy Israel. That narrative is not just simplistic, it is strategically constructed to serve a specific purpose, which is to make military action against Iran feel morally justified to an American public that would otherwise ask very reasonable questions about why their sons and daughters need to die in another Middle Eastern war. The reality of Iran is considerably more complicated. Iran is a civilization that is over 2,500 years old. It has one of the most educated populations in the Middle East. It has been subjected to foreign interference, CIA-backed coups, and decades of economic warfare in the form of sanctions that have deliberately targeted the Iranian civilian population. And Iran, despite all of that, has managed to build a sophisticated military capability, a regional alliance network that stretches from Lebanon through Syria, through Iraq, and into Yemen, and a diplomatic relationship with both Russia and China that Washington finds deeply threatening. Not because Iran is irrational, but because Iran is strategically rational, and it is aligned with the emerging multipolar world order that the United States is desperately trying to prevent. Now, when you zoom out and look at what is actually happening in the broader geopolitical picture, you start to see something that should genuinely concern every American who cares about where this country is heading. The BRICS alliance has expanded dramatically. Saudi Arabia, a country that the American foreign policy establishment treated as its most reliable Arab client state, has been in active negotiations to settle oil trades in currencies other than the dollar. China has become the world's largest trading nation. Russia, despite 2 years of the most comprehensive sanctions regime in modern history, has not collapsed economically. In fact, its economy has reoriented, it has deepened its relationships with the global south, and it continues to supply energy to countries that are quietly ignoring American pressure to cut ties with Moscow. All of this is background. All of this is the tectonic pressure building under the surface. And what you're watching with these Iran strikes and with Trump's alarming warning about bombs dropping everywhere is that tectonic pressure finding a release point. Here is what I think is really happening, and I want to be honest with you that this is analytical interpretation, not certainty. Because anyone who tells you they know exactly what is going to happen next in this situation is either lying to you or deluding themselves. But based on everything we know about the strategic incentives of the major players, here is a coherent picture of what is unfolding. There is a faction within the American foreign policy and national security apparatus, what some people call the neoconservative faction, though it runs deeper than any one political label, that has believed for a very long time that Iran must be destroyed as a regional power, not contained, not negotiated with, destroyed. Regime change, dismantlement of its military infrastructure, reintegration of Iran into a dollar-based economic system under a government friendly to Western interests. This has been the objective since at least the early 2000s, and it was articulated openly in documents like the Project for the New American Century, which laid out a vision of American dominance in the Middle East that required taking out Iraq, then Syria, then Iran in sequence. Iraq happened, Syria almost happened, but didn't quite work out the way they planned. Iran has been the big target all along, and now in this moment of cascading regional tension, with Israel having conducted military operations inside Iranian territory and Iran responding with strikes of its own, we are closer to a direct American military confrontation with Iran than we have been at any point in the last 40 years. And Trump, this is the fascinating and deeply uncomfortable part, Trump finds himself in a position where his instincts and his political pressures are pulling in opposite directions. On one hand, Trump came to power partly on the basis of being the guy who wouldn't start stupid wars, who would bring troops home, who would do deals rather than drop bombs. There is a genuine isolationist or at least non-interventionist strand in the political coalition that supports him, and those people are watching right now. On the other hand, Trump is surrounded by advisors who are deeply connected to the Israeli government and to the neoconservative foreign policy network. He has his own ego investment in appearing strong and decisive, and he is operating in a media environment that will instantly brand him as weak if he doesn't respond to Iranian actions with overwhelming force. So, when Trump says bombs will be dropping everywhere, what you're actually hearing is a man being pulled between two competing visions of American power. And the question of which vision wins, the transactional dealmaker who wants to extract concessions without bleeding American soldiers, or the chest-thumping militarist who responds to every provocation with escalation? That question has consequences that extend far beyond any single news cycle. Let me talk about the dollar for a moment, because this is the piece that almost nobody in mainstream media will connect to what's happening in the Middle East, and it is absolutely central to understanding why these conflicts keep happening. The dollar's status as the world's reserve currency is not just an economic fact, it is the foundation of American global power. It is what allows the United States to run persistent trade deficits without consequences. It is what allows Washington to fund its military adventures without ever really having to balance its books in the way that any normal country would have to. It is the mechanism through which American financial institutions extract enormous rents from the rest of the world economy. Maintaining dollar dominance is, in a very real sense, the organizing principle of American foreign policy. And the Middle East is critical to dollar dominance because of the petrodollar system, the arrangement established in the early 1970s after Nixon took the dollar off gold, whereby oil is priced and settled in dollars, which creates a permanent global demand for American currency. Any country that tries to step outside that system, Iraq under Saddam Hussein when he tried to sell oil in euros, Libya under Gaddafi when he proposed a gold-backed African currency, Iran with its various attempts to sell oil in non-dollar currencies, ends up in the crosshairs of American military and financial power. This is not a coincidence. This is a pattern. And it is the pattern that you need to understand if you want to know why the United States is once again moving toward confrontation with Iran. Iran has been actively working to develop alternative payment systems with Russia and China. Iran is part of the emerging multipolar financial architecture that threatens the petrodollar system. Destroying Iran's ability to project regional power would not just be a victory for Israeli security, It would be a victory for dollar dominance, for the banking interests that depend on dollar dominance, and for the faction of the American establishment that has staked its entire worldview on maintaining unipolar American power. Now, I want to step back from the strategic analysis for a moment and talk about something more human, because I think we sometimes get so lost in the geopolitical chess game that we forget what's actually at stake. Bombs dropping everywhere is not a metaphor. It is not a negotiating position. When bombs drop, people die. Families are destroyed. Children grow up in rubble and trauma. The infrastructure that keeps civilizations functioning, water systems, power grids, hospitals, schools, gets dismantled. And the psychological damage, the generational trauma, the radicalization that follows from experiencing your community being bombed by a foreign power, that produces the very instability and extremism that then gets used to justify more military intervention in an endless and catastrophic cycle. The American people are not well served by the framing they receive about these conflicts. They are told that this is about security, about preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, about protecting American allies. What they are not told is that the United States has 23,000 nuclear warheads and Iran has 0. What they are not told is that Iran has not launched an unprovoked offensive war against a neighboring country in over 200 years. What they are not told is that the countries the United States has attacked and destabilized in the Middle East over the last 20 years had nothing to do with September 11th, posed no existential threat to American civilians, and that those wars produced outcomes, failed states, refugee crises, the rise of ISIS, that were catastrophically bad for everyone involved, including the United States. The people who design these wars do not live with their consequences. They live in think tanks in Washington and in financial firms in New York and in government ministries in Tel Aviv. The consequences are lived by ordinary people in Tehran and Baghdad and Beirut and by American kids from small towns in Ohio and Georgia who come home from these wars in coffins or with wounds, visible and invisible, that last a lifetime. I want you to think about what America could be doing with the resources and the attention and the moral capital that it is instead spending on preparing for yet another Middle Eastern war. America has a crumbling infrastructure. It has a healthcare system that is the most expensive in the developed world and produces some of the worst outcomes. It has a mental health crisis, an opioid crisis, a housing affordability crisis. Its middle class has been hollowed out over 40 years of financialization and deindustrialization. These are solvable problems. They require political will and resources. But the political will and the resources keep getting channeled into maintaining an empire that benefits a very small number of people at the top of the financial and military industrial pyramid. And here is the deep irony, the thing that should keep you up at night if you think about it clearly. See, the empire is failing anyway. The unipolar moment is over. The dollar is being slowly but unmistakably displaced. American military power has been demonstrated to have very real limits. The global south is asserting itself. The BRICS nations represent more than 50% of global GDP at purchasing power parity. China is building infrastructure across Asia and Africa and Latin America through the Belt and Road Initiative, while Washington lectures the world about democracy. Russia has survived the sanctions. Iran has survived 45 years of economic warfare. The world is reorganizing itself around multipolarity, whether Washington wants it to or not. So the question is not whether the American-led unipolar order survives. It isn't going to survive. The question is whether the transition to a multipolar world happens through negotiation and accommodation and the building of new international institutions, or whether it happens through catastrophic military conflict as the declining power lashes out in desperation to preserve what it is losing. That is the choice that is being made right now, in real time, in the decisions being made by Trump and his advisors and the foreign policy establishment that operates around and beneath any individual president. And based on the signals coming out of Washington, the rhetoric, the troop movements, the diplomatic posturing, I am not optimistic that the right choice is being made. What I would tell you, and what I think is most important for you to take away from this analysis, is that your job as an informed citizen is to refuse the framing you are being offered. Refuse the idea that this is simply about Iranian aggression or nuclear proliferation or the survival of a democratic ally. Look at the economic interest. Look at the financial architecture. Look at the pattern of who benefits from Middle Eastern instability and who pays the price. Look at who is pushing for escalation and ask yourself what they stand to gain and look at what America actually needs and ask yourself whether another war in the Middle East brings you 1 inch closer to a country that works for the people who actually live in it. Because the bombs that Trump is warning about, if they fall, will not discriminate between the powerful and the powerless. And the world that comes out the other side of this escalation, if it isn't managed with extraordinary care and wisdom, will be one that nobody watching this video right now is going to find comfortable to live in. This is the moment that matters. Not next year, not the next election cycle. Right now. And what happens next depends, in ways that are more real than most people allow themselves to believe, on how many people are paying attention and demanding something better.